one day Hitler was telling me to come with him in the hall, and there a recording was played of Liszt's preludes. And he said the very first parts of this prelude will be the victory fanfare for the next campaign. And the next campaign will start tomorrow, and it will be Russia.
It was the biggest land battle ever fought, the bitterest and the bloodiest, for it caused the deaths of at least 25 millions. It was the head-on clash of the two mightiest armies man had ever known, and in sheer masses, miles of front, numbers of guns and shells and tanks, no other battle in history can compare with it, and certainly there'll never be another like it. Like prehistoric monsters lifting themselves out of the primeval ooze, half-blind, brainless, and above all, unbelievably savage, the two greatest totalitarian powers of all time tore at each other's throats. It was to be a fight to the finish, a fight that was to spell the end of the old Europe's dominance in international affairs, a fight that was to change irrevocably the balance of power in the world. For something unthought of before the battle began, the winner was to become the one nation on Earth capable of approaching and maybe eventually of surpassing the United States in material wealth and technological resource. Hitler had been nurturing the notion of eventually attacking Russia ever since he'd come to power in Germany in 1933. And before, if Mein Kampf, the Nazi Bible, is any guide. For in it he had written, "When we speak of new territory, we must think of Russia. Destiny itself points the way there." But Hitler's policy towards Russia was at first the same as countless Prussian and German statesmen before him, from Frederick the Great to Bismarck, to isolate Russia. If not to befriend her, then at least to keep her friendless. Though in the mid-30s, the Western powers, with their well-nigh obsessional distrust of communism, seemed to be doing that for him. Munich was just one of many international settlements from which the Russians were excluded, even though they were an ally of the Czechs, which the British, for one, weren't. And even though they alone had promised to help the Czechs if attacked, said the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt to the British ambassador in Washington, "The wealthy classes in England are so afraid of communism, which so far has not threatened them at all, that they have thrown themselves into the arms of Nazism, and now don't know which way to turn."
His name upon it as well as mine.
After Munich, while the United States, still largely isolationist, seemed not just relieved that a European war had been averted, but in truth scarcely interested, both Britain and France continued their policies of appeasing Hitler. Nazi leaders like Ribbentrop were warmly welcomed to Western capitals like Paris, despite the brutish horrors that Czechs and German Jews were already known to be suffering at the Nazis' hands. And yet more bits of paper were ceremoniously but worthlessly signed. Statesmen in Western capitals even considered seriously Hitler's idea of a greater Ukraine, ruled by German stooges, hoping against hope to satisfy Hitler's appetite for aggrandizement at the expense of hated Russia, all of which was not lost on the Russian leader Joseph Stalin, who as time went on became more and more convinced the real British and French aim was to incite Hitler against him. In Russia, the months immediately after Munich were anxious ones, although the savage political purges of the mid-30s were now largely a thing of the past. For the great mass of the Soviet people, life had become a little easier and a little more cheerful. But behind the cheerfulness doubts were already growing among some Russians of the much vaunted invincibility of the Red Army, for the purges had severely weakened the Red Army's leadership. 90% of the generals, 80% of the colonels, 3 out of 5 of the field marshals, and well over half the corps and divisional commanders had been put to death. The Soviet officer class had almost ceased to exist, something that of course had not gone unnoticed by Hitler. Before the purges, the Red Army had been the most vigorous arm of the whole Russian Revolution, ever receptive to new ideas, an example not just to the rest of Russia, but to military men the world over. Now, individual initiative was no longer at a premium in the Red Army, and the inevitable political indoctrination programs paid no heed to the new military theories of mobile warfare, of blitzkrieg and massive air power, which Hitler's young panzer chiefs were earnestly studying. But the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, in flagrant disregard of the Munich Agreement a mere 6 months before, forced the Western leaders belatedly to consider at least wooing Russia. Moscow's immediate protest to Berlin was couched in much stronger terms than British Prime Minister Chamberlain's, for instance. For as well as Prague, Hitler had also seized Memel from Lithuania, and the Hungarians had grabbed Ruthenia. The Poles, too, despite a treaty of friendship with the Czechs, had already seen fit to take advantage of their neighbours' helplessness to snatch a few hundred square miles of territory that didn't belong to them. And the Italians were about to march into Albania. To the Russians, the aggressors were getting uncomfortably close to their borders. Within the week, as the diplomatic minuet gained its momentum, the British had proposed a joint Anglo-French-Soviet-Polish undertaking to consult immediately in the event of further aggression in Europe. Russia agreed to join if Poland would, but the Poles, in the person of their wily foreign minister, Colonel Beck, persuaded Chamberlain to drop the idea in favour of a simple Anglo-French pledge to aid Poland if attacked. Chamberlain's cronies, unbelievably it seems to us today, had told him to put his money on the small, untried Polish army rather than the limitless Russians. And despite the thundering of Winston Churchill, among others, that such a guarantee was little more than a trap, unless the Soviet Union was brought in too, because neither Britain nor France had a common frontier with Poland, whereas of course Russia did. Chamberlain, again pandering to the Poles' wishes, ignored the Soviets and instead extended the pledge to both Romania and Greece, countries with which the Western powers, again, unlike Russia, did not have any sort of common frontier. In Britain, that fateful spring of 1939, a public opinion poll found 9 out of 10 favouring close cooperation with Russia. Chamberlain's reaction was simply to suggest to Russia that she give Poland and co. the self-same guarantees Britain and France had given. But it turned out they didn't want Russian guarantees. For at that time, they feared the Soviets much more than they feared the Nazis. A favourite saying of the Polish leaders was, "With the Germans we may lose our freedom, but with the Russians we shall lose our soul." Russia countered by proposing a straight Anglo-French-Soviet military alliance, which again Chamberlain, on the Poles' persuasion, turned down. To Stalin, worried about his own country's security, it was becoming increasingly clear the Western powers could not be counted on as certain allies in any coming conflict. And so he began to change his foreign policy, signalled by at first changing his foreign minister. Litvinov, the upholder of the League of Nations and the friend and confidant of the West, was replaced by Molotov, cold, ruthless, unscrupulous Molotov, Stalin's henchman, and a name and an attitude of mind the West was going to have to reckon with for a generation and more to come. Even so, Molotov's appointment brought no immediate noticeable change in Russian attitudes. In Moscow, the latest Eisenstein film, Alexander Nevsky, played with official blessing to packed houses that summer, and its theme was strongly anti-German, harking back to Russia's great medieval victory over the Teutonic Knights, and hinting heavily that any other German attack would meet with the same harsh medicine. Molotov's first major speech as foreign minister was largely an attack on Germany, though he was also critical of Britain and France. Little significance was made of his mention of an impending trade treaty with the Nazis, nor of his having successfully concluded one with fascist Italy. In Britain, pressure increased for some sort of pact with Russia, pressure which Chamberlain fobbed off by announcing a diplomatic mission to Moscow to explore an agreement. But whereas he'd been prepared to visit Germany in person to deal with Hitler, he preferred now merely to send a minor official to negotiate with Stalin, a suggestion that didn't go down at all well with the Soviet leaders, who proposed instead that Britain and France send military delegations. And after dallying a couple of weeks, the two Western powers agreed. But rather than the top generals with full negotiating powers the Russians clearly expected, Britain and France simply sent a bunch of obscure, semi-retired military gentlemen with no detailed brief. The British delegation, for one, was led by the King's Equerry, an admiral with the Noel Cowardish name of Sir Reginald Aylmer Renfurley Plunkett, -Ernley, -Early, -Drax. What's more, because the British Admiralty wouldn't release a cruiser for the purpose, and the British Foreign Office wouldn't allow them to go by plane or train, the missions journeyed by slow passenger boat, taking almost a week, and didn't arrive in Moscow until mid-August. The talks soon became bogged down on the so-called Polish obstacle. The Russians wanted the right, if necessary, to cross Polish territory to attack Germany, a right the Poles resolutely refused to grant, and nor would the British government press them on the point, a reluctance the Russian leaders interpreted as indicating no real intention to conclude a workable agreement. In the end, the Soviets issued what was almost an ultimatum, but it still elicited no suitable reply. And within 48 hours, Hitler's foreign minister, Ribbentrop, was on his way to Moscow, to the surprise of a now increasingly surprisable world, to sign a Soviet-German non-aggression pact, to all intents and purposes, the biggest about-face in history by the two bitterest rivals.
One day, when we were on the Obersalzberg and just sat down for dinner in Hitler's dining room, Hitler got a message from a servant, and he was flushing red in his face. He banged with his fist on the table, and he said with quite an emotional voice, "Now I have it, now I have it." And afterwards, he showed us a surprising thing to us, a cable of Stalin to Hitler, that the pact between Russia and Germany will be signed this evening.
A last-minute deal with Stalin must have been at the back of Hitler's mind after the Anglo-French guarantee to Poland, particularly if he was to avoid a war on two fronts when he attacked Poland, which he'd been determined to do since April. Indeed, Washington had warned London from May onwards that German diplomats had begun wooing their Russian counterparts under the guise of trade negotiations, though it was not until after the Soviet discussions with Britain and France had developed into such a farce that they began to get much response. As well as anxious for her security in the West, Russia that summer of 1939 was worried about her eastern flank, where she was fighting an undeclared, and so far as the newspapers were concerned, a largely unreported war with Japan over Outer Mongolia. Stalin was keen to end this threat to his rear, and so Hitler's promise to press the Japs to give up their claims there may well have tipped the balance in favor of a pact with the Nazis rather than one with Britain and France. But while Western statesmen were still pondering what interpretation to put on the Soviet-German pact, within the week almost, on September the 1st, Hitler attacked Poland. Despite the forecasts of Chamberlain's advisers that the Poles would hold out for at least 3 or 4 months, it was all over in less than that many weeks. On September the 3rd, after 2 days thinking about it, Britain duly honoured her pledge to Poland by declaring war on Germany, and a few hours later, the French followed suit. But as skeptics like Winston Churchill had long pointed out, honouring the pledge was of little immediate help to the Poles. Nor was any attempt made by the two allies to attack the Germans in the west to relieve some of the pressure on the Polish army in the east, all of which did not go unreported in Russia, where the official press made great play of the now evident pointlessness of the Anglo-French guarantee to Poland and the all too apparent spinelessness of the Western leaders. On September the 17th, after just 2 weeks of war, and with organized Polish resistance already tottering to a halt, the Red Army occupied the eastern half of Poland in accordance with a secret protocol of the Soviet-German Pact. A month later, while Wehrmacht and Red Army paraded together in victory celebrations, marking the honeymoon period of Soviet-German relations, Moscow branded Britain and France as the aggressor nations, not Germany, for wanting to continue the war after Poland had fallen. Having apparently secured her western frontiers as well as her eastern, Russia now turned her attention to the north, to her borders with Finland, demanding the exchange of Finnish territory just 20 miles or so from Leningrad, and from which Russia's second great city could be shelled, for a much bigger slice of Russian territory elsewhere. But the path to diplomatic concession on the part of the Finns was not eased by Moscow's arrogant handling of the matter, an arrogance influenced no doubt by the fact that many thousands of square miles of new territory in the west had been recently secured at the cost of only a few hundred Russian lives. But the Finns were to prove a vastly different kettle of fish from the luckless Poles. And when war came in November 1939, it was to cost the Russians nearly 1 million lives and to shatter once and for all the Red Army's aura of invincibility, something that again did not go unnoticed by Hitler. Although the Finns resisted heroically, so far as the Russians were concerned, the war couldn't have been waged more ineptly, and not just militarily. For as a diplomatic exercise, it was hardly a way of encouraging friends and influencing neutrals. When Soviet planes began bombing Helsinki, America called for a moral embargo on all trade with Russia, and even Italy recalled her ambassador from Moscow. Britain and France openly shipped arms to the Finns, though the Swedes would not allow Western troops to cross their territory, which, as it turned out, was a merciful relief for the Allies, for they might well have found themselves fighting the Soviets as well as the Germans that first winter of the war. All in all, it was a very low point in Russia's relations with the West. For their part, the Soviet leaders feared the Finnish war might tempt Britain and France to reconcile their differences with Germany at Russia's expense, and their suspicions were aroused by the trip in February 1940 of Roosevelt's personal representative, Sumner Welles, to Berlin, Rome, London and Paris, but not Moscow, to seek out the possibilities of a negotiated peace. Hence Stalin's alacrity in winding up the war after just 4 months, and without the Finns totally defeated. This fear of a rapprochement between the Western leaders and Hitler, which would have left the Nazis free to deal with Russia, was to haunt Stalin right up until the hour the German armies attacked him. The Red Army's poor performance against the Finns had of course been realized inside Russia itself, and steps, well-nigh panic steps, were taken to reform it. But before those reforms had really got underway, within a month in fact of the end of the Russo-Finnish War, Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway. And his effortless successes there scared the Russians stiff, for they had a vested interest in a not over-strong or understretched Germany on their western borders. And when those incredibly rapid successes were followed by the equally quick collapse of the Low Countries, the Soviets became more anxious still, which was why the miracle of Dunkirk met with almost hysterical relief among the Russian leaders. For the war in the West to have come to an end when the Red Army was still in a state of turmoil was certainly not in their interests. Significantly, it was of course while his panzers were pounding the French to a submissive pulp in early June 1940 that Hitler boasted to his generals that it would be the Russians' turn next. Indeed, just as soon as his military position made it at all possible. And in the weeks following the French armistice, as that military position became daily more and more possible, and his own popularity within Germany soared, as witness his rapturous reception in Berlin on his return from the Western Front, Hitler confided to the other Nazi leaders his determination to attack Russia not later than the following summer.
Feierliches Glockengeläute und der Jubel von Millionen empfangen den siegreichen Feldherrn in der Reichshauptstadt.
While Hitler basked in the plaudits of the Berliners, behind the scenes he was still shilly-shallying over whether or not to invade Britain that autumn.
As it was on the 31st of July, Hitler talked to the men surrounding him and told them that something must have happened in London. The British had seemed to be encouraged again, and he pretended that some discussions between Moscow and London had been overheard.
I don't believe that the Battle of Britain, from the German point of view, was connected with the beginning of Barbarossa. I think that this idea and this plan from Hitler was always on the card.
Hitler was at Berchtesgaden. Our train, the train of the Armed Operations Staff, was located at Bad Reichenhall, that's quite close to Berchtesgaden. And on this day, the 29th, Jodl, who himself also lived in Berchtesgaden, announced his visit to his staff, a seldom occasion. And we, in a mood of victory after the armistice, thought of getting some distinctions or promotions or something like that, and were shocked the more when Jodl came to our dining car. That was a place in which this communication by him was made, had the doors locked up, and only 3 or 4 of us admitted. And then he suddenly, in his usual short and dry tones, told us about Hitler's intentions to attack Russia. There was a wave of protests from all sides, particularly with regard to Britain and the danger which must come from Britain as soon as we turned against the East and against Russia. But his answer only was almost the following: one day or the other, we have to go to war against Russia. The sooner the better, particularly now, on the height of our military strength, much better than to have to call the German people once more to the arms some years later.
Stalin had long had his eyes on the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia as well as the parts of Romania known as Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. And so he seized this moment of Hitler's preoccupation elsewhere to grab them, first by a move in the north and then in the south. For he'd grown increasingly alarmed at the young Romanian King Michael's nauseous subservience to the Nazis, especially after their successes in the west. Although concerned about Romania's oil, Germany's main, indeed only oil supply, so vital for his tanks and planes and ships, Hitler dare not risk a confrontation with the Soviets at this time, what with the bulk of his forces still in the west, and so he didn't hinder the Russian occupations, but instead stepped up diplomatic pressure to woo the Balkans into the German fold. First, King Boris of Bulgaria was invited to visit Hitler that autumn, followed by Michael of Romania and Prince Paul of Yugoslavia. Russia reacted to all this by putting her industry on virtually a war footing. For when the German casualty lists for the Western campaigns were published, the Soviet leaders couldn't help but notice they were only a fraction of the Red Army's losses in the little Finnish war. What's more, in October 1940, Greece was attacked by Mussolini and the war brought into the Balkans, a possibility the Soviet leaders had been particularly anxious to avoid. As if to try to reassure themselves, Moscow made a great fuss of that November's military parades to mark the anniversary of the revolution. Though the German military attachés watching could not help but see that much of the Russian equipment, especially the airplanes, was obsolete. When the news broke later that same month that Romania had finally succumbed to the Nazi blandishments and had joined the Axis, the Russians reacted violently by accusing Berlin of violating the Soviet-German pact, which called for consultations before the annexing of further territory. To which the Nazis retorted by reminding Moscow they had not been consulted over the Soviet occupation of Bessarabia and so on. It was the beginning of the end of Soviet-German friendship, a disenchantment encouraged on the Russian side by reports of secret shipments of German arms to Finland, and even of the presence of German troops there, ostensibly en route to northern Norway. On top of this, Hitler announced the signing of a military alliance between Germany, Italy and Japan, aimed allegedly at just the United States and Britain. And when the Russians inevitably protested, Hitler invited Molotov to Berlin that November 1940 to help clarify the situation. It was a disastrous visit for Soviet-German relations.
Molotov asked that all his glasses and his plates should be boiled because he was afraid of being poisoned by bacterials.
He was blunt in his remarks, and he didn't spare Hitler at all. He was Molotov, very uncompromising, hardly smiling at all, reminding me of my mathematics teacher with the spectacles, hostile spectacles, looking at his pupil Hitler and saying, well, is our agreement, last year's agreement, still valid? And Hitler said thought it was a mistranslation. He said, of course, why not? And Molotov said, yes, I asked this question because of the Finns. You are on very friendly relations with the Finns. You invite people from Finland to Germany and you send missions there. And the Finns are very dangerous people. They undermine our security, and we'll have to do something about that. And we are going to do something about that. Whereupon Hitler exploded and said, I understand you very well. You want to wage war on against Finland. And that is quite out of the question. Do you hear me? Impossible, because my supplies of iron and of nickel and of other important raw materials would be cut.
Because the Molotov and Hitler came not to agreement, Hitler could persuade himself and his advisors and the German people it is necessary to carrying out this crusade against Bolshevik in this year, in this time.
Hitler's meeting with Molotov is said merely to have confirmed him in his resolve to crush the Russians. Even while the Soviet foreign minister was still in Berlin, Hitler ordered his generals to plan an attack for May the 15th, 1941. And within the month, they had responded with a detailed scheme which he now named for the first time Operation Barbarossa. Operation Redbeard, the name in Teutonic mythology given to Frederick the Great, resting asleep in his cave beneath the Kiefhauser Mountains, awaiting the call to arms. Hitler's generals had taken some convincing, for to attack Russia with Britain still resisting in the west was to commit the unpardonable German military sin of warring on more than one front, something that even Mein Kampf maintained to be the greatest of military mistakes. But Hitler argued, and with some truth that autumn of 1940, that Britain, although far from being beaten, was certainly not a threat, at least for the moment, and therefore, to his mind, there was no real front in the west, and so a war in the east would constitute the only front, provided it was a quick war. But Hitler had not realized the true significance of Britain having survived the air battle that autumn, had not stumbled to the simple fact that military circumstances had changed crucially since he had first plotted Barbarossa. The Luftwaffe had met its match over England and was no longer the Wehrmacht's invincible arm as it had been in Poland and France. But the Wehrmacht's morale was at its height, and the generals were headstrong as Hitler lauded them with medals, lavished them with honors, and like a feudal monarch promised them vast spoils in the east. They were putty in his hands, his ascendancy over them complete. They would march wherever he wanted them to march. Years earlier, he'd written, "Armies do not exist for the preparation of peace. They exist solely for triumphant execution in war." Hitler's logic was that Britain's hope of survival lay in Russia and the United States. If Russia was eliminated, then the United States too would be lost to Britain, because with Russia gone, Japan's power in the Far East would be greatly increased, and the United States would not dare risk a confrontation elsewhere. Therefore, Russia must be destroyed, and quickly. That spring of 1941, the German army stood undefeated, scarcely tested in fact, a superbly equipped and matchlessly trained fighting machine that had known only victory, and speedy victory at that. Who was to be its next victim? It couldn't march against Britain, not on land at least, and amphibious warfare was not to Hitler's liking. Magnetism alone, it seemed, must draw it against its sole remaining antagonist within Europe, draw it in the same way as Napoleon's armies had been drawn, when they too had been left champing at the bit at the Channel. Eastwards, ever eastwards, to the boundless, enigmatic motherland of Russia. As always in history, Russia's rulers could call on numbers without limit. In 1941, the Red Army was the largest in the world. In tanks it outnumbered, and in airplanes it equaled the rest of the world's armies put together. Despite its shortcomings, it was still better equipped than previous Wehrmacht victims, and its reorganization since the fiasco of the Finnish War was well underway. But what of its morale? And more especially, what of its leadership? Hitler felt he knew the answers. "You have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down," he told his generals, and they believed him. But the Russian leaders, for their part, still thought they could buy time while their army was made ready for the inevitable struggle. Even though by March 1941, German troops were already in Hungary and Bulgaria, as well as in Romania. Yugoslavia, too, looked like becoming another Nazi satellite, until on March the 27th, encouraged by British intelligence, a popular uprising in Belgrade pushed out the Nazi sympathizers. Surprisingly, Moscow immediately recognized the new regime and concluded a friendship and non-aggression pact with them. The very next day, Hitler attacked Yugoslavia, incensed evidently by the revolt, for he named the operation Retribution. His anger was to be his undoing, for Operation Retribution meant postponing Operation Barbarossa by 5 weeks or so. 5 weeks that were to prove crucial when later that year his panzers were thwarted at the gates of Moscow by the early winter snows. But now Russia stood by while the Luftwaffe mercilessly laid waste the capital of her new ally. That very same day, Hitler marched into Greece, again, without Russia as much as saying boo. Once more, this lack of action cannot have been lost on Hitler and his generals, and served to make them even more headstrong as the Wehrmacht swept to further swift victories. An attack on Russia seemed but a matter of time. Even so, when British and American diplomats tried to warn Stalin of German troop concentrations along the borders, Stalin merely shrugged it off, arguing to his cronies that however inevitable a Nazi-Soviet conflict might be, these present reports were simply a British ruse to rupture Russo-German relations. As it was, his own intelligence agents inside Germany itself had been sending back details of a Hitler move against Russia ever since the beginning of the year, reports which Stalin, in his wisdom, had once more chosen to ignore. Nevertheless, May Day in Moscow that year saw a particularly impressive military parade, again as if to reassure the Russian people in the face of the persistent rumors of a coming Soviet-German conflict. Rumors which the German ambassador there meticulously reported back to Berlin, for he had not been let into the Barbarossa secret. 4 days later, though, Stalin went out of his way to warn the new graduates of Moscow's military academy to be prepared to deal with a surprise German attack at any time. He also took over the leadership of the Soviet government while keeping the leadership of the Communist Party. But Russian diplomatic activity was still concentrated on appeasing the Germans at all costs, of avoiding giving them any pretext for attacking the Soviet Union, hoping to delay that attack until either the winter, when fighting conditions would favor the Russian soldiers, or else the spring of 1942, when the Red Army's reorganization would be complete. And so, while the generals lectured, Molotov and co. went out of their way to keep Hitler happy, rushing much-needed grain and raw materials to Germany. Raw materials that in a few weeks would come whistling back in the form of shells and bombs. Complying with every request from Berlin, no matter how embarrassing to national pride. Even turning a blind eye to the mounting incursions of German reconnaissance planes over Soviet-held territory. 500 such violations were reported, but went unprotested. The building of permanent frontier defenses was slowed down so as not to offend the Germans. Yet Russian spies counted no fewer than 300 recently laid landing strips within 100 miles west of the border. Intelligence which again Moscow chose to ignore. Stalin was lulled into complacency by German assurances that these troop concentrations were intended really to deceive the British and to divert attention away from a German invasion of England planned for that summer. Even as late as June the 14th, when 3 million German troops and thousands upon thousands of guns and tanks lay hidden in these woods and forests within German-held Poland, Stalin issued a statement in which he bent over backwards to deny Russian fears of a German attack and to reaffirm his belief in German friendship and German goodwill, a statement as pathetically appeasing as any of Chamberlain's Munich pontifications. Within the week, and without warning, at 3 o'clock in the morning of Sunday, June the 22nd, 1941, the Germans did attack. For 1,000 miles from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the glow from 10,000 guns lit the eastern skies. The dazed Russian soldiers were crushed and brushed aside in a holocaust of shells and bombs. Shaken from their slumbers by the clatter of tanks, the forward troops were cut down as they tried to reach their pillboxes and their dugouts. Repeatedly, the German radio operators along the line intercepted the same pathetic signal. "We are being fired on. What shall we do?" To which, more often than not, the reply came back from Russian headquarters, "You must be mad, and why is your message not in code?" The Russian defense was haphazard, without plan, depending to a very great extent on the initiative of local commanders, an initiative few dared exercise. Even when the attack had been going several hours and Hitler had already announced it to the world, the Soviet authorities were still ordering their troops on no account to cross the German border, nor to exchange artillery fire, and their pilots not to fly over Finnish or Romanian territory. And even over German territory, they were forbidden to penetrate beyond 60 miles. Bridges were captured intact. They'd not even been prepared for demolition. As well as surprise, the Germans had the advantage of an overwhelming superiority in men and firepower at those points chosen for their armored thrusts. That first day, 3 Russian infantry divisions were annihilated and another 5 cut to pieces. By the second day, with 2,000 Russian planes destroyed, the world's strongest air force, numerically at least, had been well nigh eradicated. Their air cover gone, the vast frontier armies wilted and disappeared. By the end of the first week, the Wehrmacht had advanced some 350 miles inside Russian territory and was already more than halfway to Moscow. A million Russians were killed and another 1 million taken prisoner in the first fortnight. And as the weeks went on, the Russian losses mounted, bewildering the Germans, who refused to believe such profligacy in human life could possibly continue. But at least one Wehrmacht colonel saw it all so prophetically when he wrote home, "In fighting Russia, the German army is like an elephant attacking a host of ants. The elephant will kill thousands, maybe millions, but in the end their numbers will overcome him and he will be eaten to the bone." In those first opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa, only victory seemed to be staring the Germans in the face. No one could possibly think otherwise, as the panzer units reported back to Hitler their gains of the day. Within the month, the Germans had won 500,000 square miles of new territory, an area more than double the size of their own country. It seemed merely a matter of time before Leningrad, before Moscow, before the Urals even were reached. Who could have thought then that these self-same superbly confident panzers would stagger and stumble at a place called Stalingrad, would be caught and cut to pieces at a place called Kursk, and within 4 years, 4 weary, bloody, destructive years, would have fallen back to the very bunkers of Berlin. But all that was in the future, the terrible, tearful future, as the Russian soldiers scrambled to defend their motherland that bleak midsummer morning of June the 22nd, 1941, the morning of Operation Barbarossa. Boasted Hitler to his generals, "When Barbarossa begins, the world will hold its breath." When Barbarossa was over and Hitler dead, the world still held its breath, and does yet, even to today.